3 weeks before the incident that would later be repeated across every corridor of the base. Lieutenant General Loren Brooks sat alone in a dim office at the Pentagon, signing paperwork that no one outside a handful of senior officials would ever read. The folder was thin in her hands, but the weight of it pressed against her chest like a stone carried in a coat pocket. On the cover was a single red stamp that read "Eyes Only," and beneath it a short paragraph describing a base on the eastern seaboard, where, according to 2 anonymous complaints filed by female enlisted personnel, authority had begun to curdle into something cruel. Officers were reported to bully junior personnel. Service workers were reportedly treated as furniture, called upon only when needed and dismissed when convenient. There were whispers of a particular SEAL commander whose ego had grown large enough to fill an entire hangar, whose temper had become the weather of the base, and whose laughter had begun to carry the faint, bitter edge of a man who had confused obedience with respect. Loren's orders were simple in language but heavy in consequence. She was to travel there in civilian clothes. She was to observe without announcing herself. She was to take no aid, no driver, no advance notice. She was to determine whether the base had rotted from the inside. And if it had, she was to burn the rot to the ground. No advance warning. No courtesy call. No handshake with the commanding officer before she began to look beneath his floorboards. She signed the mission letter without a flicker of hesitation. Over the course of 26 years in uniform, Loren had learned that the most dangerous enemies a soldier ever faced rarely wore the uniforms of opposing armies. More often, they wore the same uniform as the soldier herself. They wore it loosely, treated its decorations carelessly, and used the honor stitched into its threads as a club to keep the people below them in their place. Loren had fought and bled for the cloth on her shoulders. She had lost brothers to it. She had watched young women and young men break under the weight of older men who mistook rank for righteousness and who mistook fear for loyalty. None of it had ever set well with her, but she had been taught to choose her moments, the way a surgeon chooses hers. The moment, at last, had chosen her. She folded the papers, slid them into her satchel, and went home to pack a single suitcase. No medals, no decorations, no lanyard with stars, no gleaming service dress, just a modest charcoal blazer, a pale blue silk blouse, a pair of dark slacks, low-heeled shoes, and a thin silver watch she had inherited from her late father, a man who had served as a staff sergeant in Vietnam and had never once raised his voice in her presence. When she looked in the mirror before leaving, she saw what everyone else would see: an ordinary woman in her early 50s, dignified but unremarkable, walking with the quiet posture of someone who had been taught to listen more than she spoke. It was, in truth, the most dangerous uniform she had ever worn, because it would let her see what the gold-braided ones never could. The base's annual formal reception was already in full swing when she stepped through the main doors. 3 days later, crystal chandeliers hung above a polished ballroom floor, sending soft light spilling across the shoulders of officers in pressed mess dress and civilian guests in dark formal wear. Waiters passed silver trays lined with champagne flutes and sparkling water, their footsteps trained into silence. A string quartet played something gentle in the corner, the kind of music designed to make conversations feel important. Officers moved through the room, in careful orbits, greeting each other with practiced smiles and careful handshakes. Loren paused at the threshold and let her eyes sweep slowly across the room. She had been trained since her cadet days at West Point to see what others ignored, to read silence the way other officers read reports. She saw immediately what she had come to look for. 3 young enlisted sailors stood against the back wall in stiff, Silence, hands rigid at their sides. Eyes lowered. As a senior lieutenant snapped at them for the crime of standing in the wrong orbit. Across the room, a black steward in a crisp white apron was waved away like a ghost after attempting to refill a glass too quickly. A civilian contractor had been stopped at a rope line and questioned for nearly 4 minutes by a junior officer who seemed to be enjoying the confrontation far more than protocol required. A young petty officer second class, slight and unhappier than her neat uniform suggested, attempted to cross the ballroom to deliver a folded message to a duty officer and was stepped directly into her path by a passing captain who did not even glance at her before continuing his conversation. Lauren noted each moment in her mind, the way a careful surgeon notes small wounds before deciding whether the patient can be saved or requires a more drastic procedure. She accepted a single glass of water from a passing tray, found an unlit corner near a tall potted fern, and allowed the mask of quiet invisibility to settle over her shoulders. The young petty officer, whose name tag read Hale, glanced once at Lauren across the room, then turned her face away. She had been warned, in language that never quite became a threat yet could not be mistaken for anything else, that this base was not a place where women spoke unless spoken to. She had filed 2 of the complaints that had brought Lauren here, both under a male colleague's name, both retracted within a week. Lauren had been told about her in writing. The orders in that folder were simple: find out what had happened to her. It was in Lauren's quiet corner, almost 20 minutes later, that the night finally turned on its hinges. Lieutenant Grant Mercer entered the ballroom the way a man enters his own living room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore his seal trident like a small badge of godhood over the left breast of his dress blues. Behind him, in a loose semicircle, walked 4 younger officers who clearly believed that proximity to him was itself a promotion. Around him, the air seemed to rearrange itself. Several women in civilian attire smiled at him. Several men nodded toward him with the eager loyalty of men who understood pecking order. Mercer moved through all of it like a man who had learned to consume attention the way other men consumed oxygen. He was admired. He was feared. He was flattered. And he had mistaken every one of those reactions for the sound of his own greatness. He had not yet noticed Lauren, but his eyes roamed the room the way a predator scans an open field. Then, his gaze settled on her, the lone woman in the modest blazer holding a plain glass of water. There were no stars on her shoulders. There were no stripes on her sleeves. There were no jingling clusters of ribbons that said she had bled for her rank. There was nothing, in Mercer's view, that explained her presence in the VIP section of the reception. And so he decided, in the careless way of powerful men who have never been taught the meaning of restraint, to make her an example of something. Perhaps he wished to amuse his entourage. Perhaps he wished to remind the room that he was the loudest voice in it. Perhaps he simply enjoyed the small, bitter thrill of bending an unassuming stranger to his will. Whatever the reason, he changed his course and walked straight toward Lauren with the slow, deliberate swagger of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He stopped a foot from her. His shadow swallowed the light on her face. He looked down at her with the practiced smile of a superior officer greeting a subordinate he intended to break. His voice was pitched loud enough to carry across 3 nearby tables because the volume was part of the weapon. "What's your rank, sweetheart?" The word sweetheart landed like an open palm across her face. Across the room, 2 officers turned toward the sound. Lauren did not flinch, did not stiffen, did not shift her weight. She lifted her glass, took a slow, measured sip of water as if she had not heard him, and looked up at him with the calm of a woman who had survived far worse weather than his. "I beg your pardon," she said, with the kind of polite tone that refuses to give an enemy something to grip. Mercer's smirk widened. His entourage laughed the way hyenas laugh when the alpha lion has decided to toy with one of their own. Bystander officers turned away in discomfort, but none stepped forward. None dared, even with their eyes, to suggest Mercer might be wrong. The silence of bystanders had a shape, and Lauren recognized it instantly. The shape of a culture that had rotted for too long without anyone willing to call it by name. "I asked you a question," Mercer pressed, his voice rising for the room to hear. "What is your rank? Because I don't see any officer here without rank. And I don't see any invitation either. So either you tell me what you're doing on my floor, or I'm going to assume you're lost and have security walk you out like the stray you look like." Lauren set her glass down on a tray carried by a passing waiter, who flinched at the sound of Mercer's voice and seemed to want to disappear entirely into the wood paneling. She simply stood taller, in that quiet way her father had taught her, and allowed Mercer's insults to register in the silent ledger she had been keeping since she stepped through the front door. Mercer was only beginning. Annoyed by her unbroken calm, by the fact that she had not raised her voice, by the fact that she had somehow looked him in the eye without flinching, he reached for the guest lanyard hanging from her neck. The laminated badge had a small silver clip stamped with the seal of the receiving command. Mercer snapped it open with one hand and pulled the lanyard free in a single dismissive motion. He looked at it for a half-second, the way a man looks at a piece of trash before deciding which bin deserves it, and then he flicked it into the nearest wastebasket. Several officers gasped softly. The string quartet lost their rhythm for a beat and recovered with the instincts of musicians, paid to be background. "There," Mercer said, smoothing his jacket. "Now you definitely don't belong here." His entourage rewarded him with another ripple of laughter, slightly less certain, because even men accustomed to cruelty can feel the room tilt when cruelty goes too far. Lauren stood where she had been left, her neck bare, her only proof of entry resting in a brass bin among wet napkins and empty stirrers. She did not bend. She did not protest. She allowed him one more long moment of triumph, because every moment he took was another inch of rope around his own neck. "Now," Mercer said, his voice dropping into a low, intimate pitch that was somehow worse than the shout, "since you don't want to answer questions, I have a better idea. See that spill?" He pointed to a small puddle of champagne a younger officer had knocked over moments earlier. "You're going to get down on your knees, clean that up with the napkins on that tray, and then apologize for being in a section of this base where you clearly do not belong. And if you refuse," he added, "I will have security carry you out of this reception and have you banned from this base for life. Do we have an understanding, sweetheart?" The word sweetheart again. Twice is no longer a slip. Twice is a pattern. Twice is policy. Lauren finally spoke. Her voice was unhurried and low, and yet it carried the kind of clarity that cuts through noise the way a single bell cuts through a crowded street. "Before I answer," she said, "I have a question of my own. Lieutenant Mercer, do you treat every civilian and every subordinate on this base the way you are treating me right now? Is this how you speak to people when senior leadership isn't?" Mercer laughed. It was the laugh of a man who believed he had nothing left to fear. He straightened his posture, puffed his chest, and turned to the room as if delivering a sermon he had delivered many times before. "Senior leadership," he said, almost proudly. Listen to her. There is no senior leadership on this floor that matters more than me. I run this base. The officers you see nodding at me know. The enlisted personnel know it. The contractors know it. The civilians know it. And you, sweetheart, are about to learn it too. There is no brass above me who gives a damn what I do with civilians or low lives who forget their place. I am the brass. He did not notice the sting in his own words, because he had been breathing that air for so long that he had forgotten it could ever be poisonous. He did not see. Behind him, Petty Officer Danielle Hale slipped quietly out of the ballroom and through a side door, because the instructions Lauren had passed her that morning through an encrypted line told her exactly where to be and when. He did not see her press a small recording device into the palm of a waiting officer outside. He did not know that every word he had just spoken had been captured for the second time that night, sealed, time-stamped, and on its way to a server whose location was known to only 6 people in the federal government. Lauren looked at him the way a doctor looks at a patient who has finally, mercifully said the thing the doctor needed to hear him say. "Thank you, Lieutenant Mercer," she said quietly. "That will be enough." Before Mercer could respond, before his entourage could laugh again, before the quartet could stumble into another misplaced note, the heavy double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open with the kind of authority that does not ask permission. Every head in the room turned. The music died mid-phrase. Conversations froze with champagne glasses halfway to lips. 4 figures stepped through the doorway in perfect, deliberate unison. There was no hesitation in their stride. There was no warmth in their faces. There was no confusion about who they were or why they had come. There was only the steady, terrible certainty of men who had been summoned by a single word from a single woman, and who had answered without delay. 4 four-star generals. Mercer saw them and made the only mistake a man like him could make. He assumed they were there for him. He straightened his jacket, snapped his shoulders back, and executed a parade ground salute so crisp it could have been carved from marble by a master sculptor. He even allowed himself the indulgence of a small, victorious glance toward Lauren. His eyes said everything his mouth did not. They said, "This is the end of you, sweetheart. The men who decide are finally here, and they are mine." The 4 generals did not stop for Mercer. They did not pause at his salute. They did not look at him. They marched past him as if he were made of air. Their polished shoes clicked against the ballroom floor in a rhythm that sounded like the tick of an enormous clock counting down the last seconds of a man who had believed himself eternal. Mercer's arm, still raised in salute, trembled once and then fell slowly to his side. His smirk dissolved in real time, replaced by the pale confusion of a man who has just realized that the building he thought he was standing in is not the building he is actually inside. The building he is actually inside is the one he has been dismantling with his own hands, one insult at a time, for years. The 4 generals stopped directly in front of Lauren. They arranged themselves in 2 even rows. The senior among them, a silver-haired man whose name had been spoken with reverence in the halls of the Pentagon for nearly 2 decades, brought his right hand up in a sharp, synchronized salute. The other 3 followed as if their bodies had been tuned to the same hidden note. The entire ballroom could hear the small, sharp intake of Lauren's breath. Not from fear, but from the weight of the moment she had spent 26 years walking toward, and had finally on this particular night arrived at. She returned their salute with the same precision, lowered her hand, and waited for the room to catch up. Lieutenant General Brooks. The senior general said, his voice steady as a flagpole in a hurricane. On behalf of the Joint Chiefs and the Office of the Inspector General, we are here to receive your preliminary report and to provide you with the full weight of command authority for the remainder of this inspection. We are also here, at your request, to acknowledge the courage of Petty Officer Danielle Hale, whose complaints originally filed under a colleague's name because she feared for her career, have now been verified by independent sources. The ballroom did not so much fall silent as it ceased to exist for sound. Every officer in the room seemed to forget how to swallow. Several of Mercer's entourage took a half-step backward, as if they could somehow unbe standing next to him. The two officers who had laughed during the insults were already studying the tops of their shoes as if the answer to their own futures lay somewhere in the stitching. The steward in the white apron looked up for the first time all evening. The three young enlisted sailors against the wall lifted their chins a full inch, and from the side door, which had been quietly closed and reopened, Petty Officer Danielle Hale stepped back into the ballroom, her eyes wet, her name tag suddenly visible to every officer in the room as if a small light had been placed behind it. The room looked at her, and for the first time in her career at this base, she did not look away. Mercer stood 3 feet away from the woman he had just called sweetheart for the second time, and his face, in the span of a single breath, lost every drop of color it had ever carried. The blood drained from his lips. The sweat began at his hairline. His metal ribbons, which had seemed so brilliant 10 minutes earlier, now looked like decorations on a man standing at the edge of his own grave. He opened his mouth to speak and produced nothing. He closed it. He opened it. Again. Nothing came. The sound that came instead was the small, sharp click of a single door closing behind him, somewhere deep in the architecture of his own career. Lauren did not look at him immediately. She let the silence do its work. She let the 4 generals lower there. She let the room feel the full crushing weight of what had just happened. She even let her eyes pass briefly over Hale, who was now standing near the back of the room, not trembling for the first time that evening. Then, when the silence had been allowed to harden into something permanent, she finally turned to face him. Her voice, when she spoke, was so quiet that the room had to lean in to hear it, and yet every syllable landed like a hammer. "Lieutenant Mercer," she said, "this base has received 8 separate complaints regarding officer misconduct over the past 18 months. 3 of those complaints came from junior enlisted personnel who were afraid to file formal grievance reports because they feared retaliation from members of your unit. 2 of those complaints were filed by civilian contractors who described being humiliated in front of their peers in precisely the manner in which you have just humiliated me. One of those complaints included a recording. That recording captured your voice saying almost exactly the words you said to me tonight." She paused. Her eyes did not blink. "I did not come to this reception in these clothes because I was lost, and I did not come without rank because I had forgotten who I was. I came in these clothes because I needed to see what kind of officers this base produces when they believe no one of consequence is watching. The fact that you could not tell the difference between a civilian and a lieutenant general is not my failure, Lieutenant. It is yours. The fact that you could not treat a woman in plain clothes with basic human respect is not my embarrassment. It is yours. The fact that you felt comfortable enough to threaten me, to steal my identification, to order me to kneel on a ballroom floor like a dog, and to boast that no senior leadership on earth could touch you is not a reflection of my authority. It is a reflection of how completely you have misunderstood the uniform you wear. She turned to the senior general. General, the inspection has concluded. I am formally recommending that Lieutenant Grant Mercer be stripped of his command authority immediately, that his service weapon be confiscated, that his trident be revoked pending review, and that every member of his operational squad be placed under formal command investigation for patterns of misconduct consistent with the complaints already on file. I am also recommending that a full culture audit be initiated at every level of this base, beginning tonight, and that whistleblower protections be extended retroactively to every enlisted sailor and civilian contractor who filed or attempted to file a complaint in the last 2 years. I am further recommending that Petty Officer Danielle Hale be promoted 1 grade, with back pay effective immediately, and that she be reassigned to the office of the Inspector General, where her voice will never again be required to hide behind a false name. The senior general nodded once, as if he had been waiting for precisely those words. Consider it done, Lieutenant General. 2 military police officers, who had been stationed near the doorway in plain sight, and whom Mercer had failed to notice all evening, stepped forward. One of them reached for Mercer's sidearm with the practiced care of a man who had done it 100 times before. The holster clicked open. The weapon was lifted. The trident, that small badge of godhood Mercer had worn so proudly, was unpinned from his chest and placed into an evidence bag by a second officer, without a word. Mercer did not resist. He could not. The sound of his own heartbeat was all that was left inside his chest. As the MPs led him toward the door, his entourage did not move. None of them attempted to walk beside him. None of them reached out a hand. They stood in the precise spots where they had stood, while he wielded his cruelty, and they watched him leave as strangers might watch a leaf drift past a window, already forgotten before it touches the ground. Lauren turned her attention then to the rest of the room. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her presence was enough. Officers of this command, she said, what happened tonight is not about one man. It is about a culture. A culture in which a decorated officer could walk up to a stranger and call her sweetheart without consequence. A culture in which bystanders could laugh rather than intervene. A culture in which a young steward could be waved away like furniture and a junior sailor could be shouted down for standing in the wrong place. A culture in which power was treated as entertainment and honor as decoration. She paused. She let the silence hold. I want to be very clear. The uniform we wear is not a costume. It is not a trophy. It is not a license. It is a covenant. The moment any of us forgets that, we become exactly the kind of officer the enemies of this country pray we will. Become hollow men in beautiful suits, walking around in borrowed light. She glanced briefly toward the back of the room, where Petty Officer Hale stood watching her with tears she would never again be required to apologize for. Your courage to file complaints, even when you were afraid, is the reason this inspection happened. Your voices are the reason justice is being delivered tonight. From this moment forward, those voices will be protected. They will be heard. They will be remembered. One of the young sailors, a young woman who had been trembling at the wall for the entire evening, lifted her chin a full inch and did not put it back down. The steward, in the white apron, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and then straightened his apron as if to remind himself that he, too, was part of the institution Lauren had just begun to rebuild. The string quartet, after a long, uncertain moment, struck a single slow, Deliberate note, not a melody. Just one note as if to signal that the building was once again gently beginning to breathe. Lauren took one last look at the ballroom. The crystal chandeliers were the same. The light was the same. The faces in the room were not the same. Something had shifted in them. The way a floor shifts in the seconds after an earthquake, when nothing is different, and yet nothing is ever the same again. The four generals offered her their arms. She walked out of the ballroom between them. As she passed the waste bin where Mercer had thrown her lanyard, she paused, reached in, and retrieved it herself. She did not hand it to anyone else. She clipped it back onto her neck, where it belonged, and continued out the door. Outside, the night was cool and very still. Somewhere across the base, an engine hummed quietly in a hangar. Somewhere on the other side of the ocean, young sailors who had never met Lauren were about to learn that the uniform they wore had been defended by a woman they would never see. And somewhere behind her, inside the ballroom she had just left, a room full of officers was learning, slowly and painfully, that the rank on a shoulder is not the measure of the person beneath it. Lieutenant General Lauren Brooks did not look back. Her work had only just begun. But the silence behind her, broken only by the slow, uneven breathing of a man whose empire had just evaporated in a single salute, was already the loudest applause she had ever received.